Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Snoop4Truth. It is October 10th, 2019, and today we're going to be taking a look once again at a hoax perpetrated by D.Tavares. Today we're going to be looking at the London accounting firms will bankrupt all of our cities hoax. And in this hoax, D.Tavares fraudulently claims that the global elite have a plan to bankrupt all of our cities by billing them excessive amounts for accounting services. She also claims that through these accounting services, the global elite have placed a value on the air that we breathe, on our freshwater resources, on every single tree in our forests, and on all of our other natural resources. Finally, she claims that this value is actually a price that we will have to pay the global elite for our air, water, trees, and other natural resources. But, as you've probably already guessed, none of this is actually so. Let's take a listen to what Deborah has been saying around the country about this specific hoax.
And air resources that all major organizations consume. In other words, they're going to be creating revenue and increased tax by putting a value on all natural resources. Now, I know we used to joke around. We'll be charged for the air we breathe. It's important to know we are now going to be charged for the air we breathe. In fact, every single thing is going to have a value. They're even going to issue insurance on coral reefs. Coral reefs. They're going to charge and categorize and inventory every single thing. Now, I will tell you, when we attended an IEEE meeting in San Jose a number of years ago, we heard the beginnings of this. And when we get back from the break, I'll talk about that.
Deborah, my mouth is on the floor right now, what you just said. I don't know if our audience understands what you just said. I'm starting to get a hold of it. We'll be back right after this and get into it. StopTheCrime.net is Deborah's web address. Ours, of course, is thepowerhour.com. Stay tuned. Talking to Deborah Tavares, StopTheCrime.net. We are the Power Hour, of course. I've got some emails about Deborah. You know, we've had Deborah on quite a bit here the last little bit with the fires that are going on in Northern California. There's a reason. Deborah Tavares is that woman that's on the edge of a razor here. And she is going in and finding information that nobody sees. I mentioned 1933 at the beginning on her introduction, and I'm going to have you answer this question, ladies and gentlemen. Why do you think they made the American people the enemies in 1933? Really, and you can go look at the statute. This isn't me or Deborah making this up. You can go read the statute yourself.
93549.
There you go. You can go read it yourself. Why did the government make you, the American people, the enemy? The short and long answer is simply because you had all the power. So they want the power, so you are the enemy. And what they really want as an extension of that is ownership of the land, the dominion that God gave you, going all the way back to the Bible. I mean, this is as big as you want to take it. You were given the land. You were given the dominion by your Creator. The American law, the Constitution, solidified that and indemnified that in law. So a syndicate comes up, and how are they going to take that power away? And so what Deborah is describing now is an overlay of a corporate system putting a monetary value to everything you see that God has endowed you with, the trees, the air, the water, the everything. The dominion that God has declared to you, they are putting a value on and putting it under the corporate umbrella of this government. The enforcement arm of this will be the United States government or some global government, but you think it's the Constitution. No. This is the corporation. You are a corporate subject under this system. Deborah, correct me if I've said anything wrong in that little summary, and then please continue.
Well, that's absolutely true. And now what we are discovering is that it is now expanding in all of our corporate cities. And what is expanding now is the fact that the cities can no longer sustain the amounts of expense for the weaponized disasters that are hitting us all. They can no longer withstand the cost of the disruption. And they talk about that in Ernst and Young's ability to help the cities come up with new types of revenue, pricing the air we breathe, pricing and taking and making inventory on every single item. This is a plan that calls for governments to take control of all land use and not leave any of the decision-making in the hands of any of us. In fact, we know in Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, they talk about this extensively, but the controllers have assumed that the people are not good stewards of the land, and that the government will do a better job if it's completely in control of everything. So what is happening is people should be, in their opinion, rounded up off of the land, which is what we're seeing now with the decimation of the fires and the elimination of cities now, and packed into human areas designated for high-density sky-rise settlement zones or islands where humans will habitate. And what we have to understand is that these planned islands are going to be so massively entrenched with wireless devices and wireless frequencies, the electro-smog in these areas will be unsurvivable. This is plain and simple, a genocide plan. And the plan is a whole life plan. It involves every aspect of the educational system, the energy market, transportation system, the governmental system. It is called governance. Includes healthcare and food production. Every single thing will be inventoried, categorized, priced, and controlled. All natural resources, including the air. And we were warned, and we never really understood. And I'll just say it again, because it needs to be said, and people need to listen to what JFK warned us about. And I know that at various times, as we start to understand the enormity of what we face, we can go back and look at some of these things back then, and they now have a meaning.
Leader in assurance, tax, transaction, advisory services, and they're one of the largest professional service organizations in the world. And, of course, the World Bank and all the big banks are involved in this as well. They talk about how they have helped our country, the Secretary of the United States Department of Treasury, the tax policy under the George W. Bush administration. And they were also tasked to work under President Clinton to serve on the U.S. Social Security Administration Advisory Board. They advise the presidents and Congress on all aspects of Social Security system. And held other U.S. government and policy positions, including Chief of Staff of President Clinton's 1994 Bipartisan Commission. Also, for tax reform, etc. Also, they talk about how they were the advisor for the National Commission on Economic Growth and Tax Reform and commissioner on National Commission on Retirement Policies. They also worked with Washington, D.C.-based law and legislative advisory firms, and they merged into Ernst & Young and now operates as the Washington Counsel Ernst & Young. Also, it's important to note that Ernst & Young has played an active role in the World Economic Forum, serving as the member of its International Business Council and Global Agenda Steward. The CEO of Ernst & Young has also co-chaired the Russian Foreign Investment Advisory Council with Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedevich, hope I said that correctly, and serves as chairman of the International Business Leaders Advisory Council to the mayor of Shanghai. Is on the board of directors of the Washington, D.C.-based U.S. Business Roundtable. So Ernst & Young is literally hired by USA Inc.
That is different for
D.Tavares says that her factual basis for making these claims is a December 26, 2017 newspaper article in the Press Democrat, which is a local Santa Rosa newspaper. For reasons that are now crystal clear, D.Tavares never posted the subject article online or provided links to it, but she claimed it stated that Ernst & Young would bankrupt the city of Santa Rosa because the city had hired Ernst & Young to determine the amount that the city had lost as a result of the recent fires in Northern California. D.Tavares also says another factual basis for her claims about Ernst & Young is that Ernst & Young's website, which indicates that it is a 200-year-old international accounting firm based in London, which serves international clients. But then D.Tavares claims that the website indicates that Ernst & Young is the global value determinator, which places a value on all of the Earth's natural capital or natural resources, and that Ernst & Young is really acting on the behalf of international bankers. Let's take a look at some actual background of Ernst & Young and some additional information that you'll find important while we take a look further into this hoax. We're over on Wikipedia just to take a look at who Ernst & Young actually is. So we see that Ernst & Young is a London-based firm which offers a number of professional services to governments and businesses, including accounting, legal, and risk assessment. Let's go ahead and take a look at U.S. Code 5121, the congressional findings and declarations. Let's look at the actual law here. See, when American cities, counties, or states incur financial losses in a natural disaster, they may request reimbursement from the federal government, FEMA, and any state counterpart. But FEMA requires audited accounting of all amounts sought in reimbursement. Further, special knowledge and expertise is required to prepare the federal reimbursement requests and in appealing any FEMA denials for reimbursement. Taking a look at Section B here, it states, it is the intent of the Congress by this chapter to provide an orderly and continuing means of assistance by the federal government to state and local governments in carrying out their responsibilities to alleviate the suffering and damage which result from such disasters by 1. Revising and broadening the scope of existing disaster relief programs. 2. Encouraging the development of comprehensive disaster preparedness and assistance plans, programs, capabilities, and organizations by the states and by local governments. 3. Achieving greater coordination and responsiveness of disaster preparedness and relief programs. 4. Encouraging individuals, states, and local governments to protect themselves by obtaining insurance coverage to supplement or replace governmental assistance. 5. Encouraging hazard mitigation measures to reduce losses from disasters, including development of land use and construction regulations. And 6. Providing federal assistance programs for both public and private losses sustained in disasters. As always, these links will be in the description for you to take a look at. If you'd like to look further into the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards of funding, this is the chapter that you would look at. The newspaper article that D.Tavares is actually referring to was titled Santa Rosa Tapping Reserves for Fire Consultant. It was written by Will Schmidt of the Press Democrat and reads, Santa Rosa will dig further into its budget reserves to pay an additional $813,000 to the disaster relief consultant it retained after the October 2017 fires. The extension approved by the Santa Rosa City Council last week retains London-based consulting firm Ernst & Young through May and brings the total maximum value of the contract to $2.3 million. The cost of the extension was not included in the city's current budget forecast, which had estimated Santa Rosa would have $6.5 million in reserves. The cost of fire damage and the resulting recovery efforts have eaten into the city's reserve funding and exacerbated the strain of Santa Rosa's existing budget deficit though the city's funding woes were buoyed somewhat by the passage of a quarter-cent sales tax hike approved by voters in November. That tax increase will take effect in April. Ernst & Young, which has an office in San Francisco, was hired in December of 2017 to help local officials assess damage from the 2017 wildfires, request reimbursement from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and represent the city in reimbursement talks with FEMA and the California Office of Emergency Services. Ernst & Young also worked with the city and another outside advisor, Haggerty Consulting, to assess the city's unmet disaster needs, a figure estimated at about $400 million. Much of Ernst & Young's efforts have been behind the scenes, but please take a look at this for yourself. City Manager Sean McGlynn told the City Council last week that the contract extension would be the last one between Santa Rosa and Ernst & Young for this disaster recovery. He noted that Santa Rosa's efforts to secure reimbursement will be far from finished once the contract is up. Quote, there is going to be a huge amount of time and energy spent by staff in managing this, McGlynn said. The city expects state and federal reimbursement for most of the costs of the Ernst & Young contract, according to a staff report. This means that FEMA will reimburse the city except for the tiny portion of Ernst & Young's fees associated with the city's reimbursement requests for lost city property that was never eligible for reimbursement by FEMA in the first place. The report also noted that while the city's budget reserves are depleted, there is sufficient funding to pay out the contract, which will be reimbursed by FEMA anyway. The City Council is set to consider budget cuts and hold a public hearing on city spending priorities as part of its January 29th meeting. You can reach staff writer Will Schmidt at 707-521-5207, or you can email him at the email address that you find on your screen right now. No city in the United States is going bankrupt as a result of hiring Ernst & Young to assess fire damage or to assist in obtaining reimbursement from FEMA. What Deborah Tavares did not know when creating this hoax is that under the law, the administrative costs that a city, county, or state incurs is in their efforts to obtain reimbursement from FEMA are also themselves reimbursed by FEMA, not just the value of the city-owned property destroyed in the disaster. That means, under the law, the cost of Ernst & Young's accounting services are themselves reimbursed by FEMA and ultimately cost the city absolutely nothing whatsoever. But, once again, Deborah Tavares does not know enough to realize this. What you're going to find on your screen are the administrative costs that FEMA reimburses cities for, not just the costs of city-owned property destroyed in the disaster. Note that all of these services are the very same services that Ernst & Young renders to the city under the contract. So under the law, FEMA will reimburse the city for all of the costs of Ernst & Young's contractual services. After all, it is FEMA itself which requires the auditing services of third-party accounting firms like Ernst & Young in the first place to provide reliable, audited information for FEMA so as to make certain that FEMA does not over-reimburse or under-reimburse cities, counties, and states after disasters. So it is only fair that FEMA pay for those costs. That means that the city of Santa Rosa will not go bankrupt as a result of hiring Ernst & Young or similar firms to perform audited certified accounting of disaster losses. That also means that no other city, county, or state in the United States which hires firms like Ernst & Young will go bankrupt either. This is because under the law, all of the costs of such accounting services and administrative costs which are reimbursed by FEMA. It is a fact, in order for Ernst & Young to do its job in obtaining reimbursements for cities, counties, and states, etc., it is necessary that it has to place a value on all damaged or destroyed city-owned property, infrastructure, roads, bridges, buildings, utilities, and public lands. There is nothing diabolical or nefarious about that. A city cannot obtain reimbursement from FEMA without determining the amount to be reimbursed, which is dependent on the value of damaged or destroyed city-owned property, a value determined by Ernst & Young. But Tavares fraudulently claims that Ernst & Young is acting on behalf of the global elite to place a value on the air that we breathe, on our fresh water resources, on every tree in our forest, and on all other natural resources. But nothing in the article or elsewhere suggests that Ernst & Young has or will place a value on the air, water, or on every single tree in the forest, etc. Deborah Tavares claims that this process of Ernst & Young placing a value on the air and water and all other natural resources is currently going on across the globe in order to enslave all of mankind into paying for natural resources that they already have. Deborah Tavares falsely claims that the value that Ernst & Young places on all of these natural resources is actually a, quote, price that all of mankind will have to pay to the global elite in exchange for these natural resources. Finally, Deborah Tavares falsely claims that the local governments, like the city of Santa Rosa, will act as collection agents for the global elite in this regard and will levy new taxes on all of mankind to pay the global elite for all of these natural resources on which Ernst & Young has allegedly placed a, quote, value, but none of this is actually so. So here's the conclusion. For reasons I've already stated in this video, all of Deborah Tavares' claims are verifiably false. Ernst & Young does not bankrupt cities. Ernst & Young assists cities by helping them collect reimbursement from FEMA for the value of destroyed city-owned property and other reimbursable losses caused by such disasters, and ultimately Ernst & Young's services cost the cities nothing whatsoever, because under the law, The costs of Ernst & Young's accounting services are themselves a cost reimbursed by FEMA. Finally, Ernst & Young does not place a value on the air that we breathe, the water we drink, or place a value on every single tree in our forests. Instead, Ernst & Young only places a value on destroyed city-owned property and other reimbursable losses caused by such disasters. For those of you that enjoy listening to conspiratorial talks and websites and YouTube channels, please use discernment. Take a look at the actual facts. 9 times out of 10, particularly when watching D.Tavares, you're going to find that she has not only exaggerated the facts, but left them out entirely in exchange for inciting fear, hatred, and just plain, I guess, attempting to try to get people to watch her YouTube channel and go to her website and donate to her. It's sickening. It's disgusting. And it's wrong. Everybody have a wonderful day. And once again, thank you to Snoop for doing this research that will allow all of us to sleep a little bit better at night when having to deal with con artists and frauds like D.Tavares.